The side door of our house had a loose brass latch that usually clicked twice when it closed. I had asked Warren to tighten it 3 times since the autumn damp set in, but like most small domestic failures in our home, it had simply become part of the background noise. On that Tuesday, I lifted the handle slightly as I turned the key, a habit of muscle memory I didn't even think about. The door swung open without a sound. I was early because the clinic had rescheduled my bone density scan. When you reach 56, your calendar begins to fill with appointments designed to measure how quickly you are thinning out, how much of you is slowly dissolving. The house smelled of old wood polish and the leftover vegetable soup I had simmered the night before. But beneath that, there was a faint trace of lavender. It wasn't my scent. Mine was chamomile and vanilla, heavy and medicinal. The lavender belonged to Teresa. I didn't call out. When you have spent 32 years anticipating the needs of others, you develop an involuntary habit of stepping quietly, of not wanting to disturb the air before you enter a room. They were standing by the kitchen island, near the wooden block where the small paring knives are kept. The afternoon sun was coming through the window behind them, cutting through the steam of 2 mugs of tea. Teresa's back was to me. She was wearing the gray wool cardigan I had bought her for her 46th birthday. The one she had complained was too scratchy but had kept anyway. Warren was facing her. His head was tilted slightly, his shoulders rounded in a way I hadn't seen since our eldest son, Mitchell, had left for college 12 years ago. It was the posture of a man trying to make himself smaller, softer, more accessible. His hand was on the counter, palm up. Teresa's fingers were threaded through his. They weren't moving. They were simply locked together, resting on the dark granite like a dropped glove. "She doesn't see it," Teresa was saying. Her voice was low, carrying that familiar, breathless quality that had always made our father forgive her for losing his tools or denting the station wagon. "She's so busy keeping the ledger, Warren. She doesn't see how much we're both carrying." Warren didn't answer with words. He simply tightened his thumb over her knuckle. He squeezed once, twice, a rhythmic, private communication that had no place in my kitchen. I stood in the narrow shadow of the pantry door. The linoleum under my feet was cold. I had scrubbed that floor on hands and knees the previous Friday because Warren said the mop left streaks. A woman can spend 30 years building a sanctuary, selecting the curtains, polishing the brass, and ensuring the drafts are kept out, only to realize she has merely constructed a very comfortable cage for herself. And the people she built it for are simply waiting for her to step out so they can enjoy the warmth without her. I let my car keys slip from my fingers. They hit the linoleum with a sharp, heavy metal clatter. The movement was instantaneous. Their hands parted so quickly that Teresa's sleeve caught the edge of her mug, sending a dark brown wave of English breakfast tea across the granite. It dripped down the side of the cabinet, hitting the floor with a soft, steady tap, tap, tap. Warren looked up first. His face didn't go pale. Instead, a dull, blotchy red crept up from his collar, settling in the thin skin beneath his eyes. He looked, more than anything, annoyed. "Lorraine," he said. His voice was too loud, too hearty. "You're back early. We thought you were at the medical center until 4. Teresa didn't turn around immediately. She reached for the paper towel holder first, pulling 3 sheets with a dry, ripping sound. Only when she had crumpled them into the puddle of tea did she look at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were wide, wet, and perfectly steady. "Lorraine, thank goodness," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to suggest she was the one who had been startled by an intruder. I came over because the plumbing in my building is backed up again, and Warren was just helping me figure out if we need to call a tenant lawyer. I've been so overwhelmed." The tea is stain-heavy, I said. My voice sounded small to my own ears, dry and flat, like paper sliding across a desk. I didn't look at Warren. I walked past them to the small closet by the stairs, unbuttoned my coat, and hung it on the wooden hanger with the blue velvet cover, the hanger I had recovered myself when the wire began to rust. "Lorraine," Warren said, following me into the hall. He smelled of the pine soap he used and the cedar shavings from his basement workshop. "Teresa's had a terrible week. Her landlord is threatening to withhold her deposit. She was practically in tears when she walked in." "I see," I said. I smoothed the lapels of my coat. "And did you find a lawyer?" "We were just talking about it," he said. He reached out, his hand hovering near my elbow before dropping back to his side. He was using his public voice, the one he used when he was explaining the lawn care schedule to our neighbors or explaining to the bank teller why a deposit had been delayed. "You know how she gets. She panics. I was just calming her down." "You always have been very good at calming her," I said. I went back into the kitchen. Teresa was still wiping the counter, her movements small and frantic. The gray cardigan was damp at the cuffs where she had let the tea soak in. "Let me do that," I said, taking the wet paper towels from her hand. Our fingers touched briefly. Hers were warm and slightly sticky with sugar. Mine were cold from the wind outside. "I'm sorry about the mess, Rainey," she said, using the childhood nickname she only used when she wanted to borrow something or when she had forgotten my birthday. "I didn't mean to just burst in, but Warren always knows what to do with these things." "Yes," I said, throwing the sodden paper into the bin beneath the sink. "He's very practical when it's someone else's house." A silence settled over the room then, not a sudden dramatic silence, but a thick, familiar weight that felt like the dust that accumulates on the high shelves you can't reach without a stool. Warren stood in the archway between the kitchen and the dining room, his hands stuffed into his pockets. He was looking at his shoes, then at the clock shaped like a copper skillet on the wall. It was 3:20. Mitchell would be calling from Chicago in 40 minutes. It was our Tuesday routine. He would ask about my knee, I would ask about his wife's mother, and then Warren would take the phone to talk about the lawn or the oil change. "Well," Teresa said, her voice rising in a forced, bright register that made my head ache behind my eyes. "I should let you two get settled. I'll call that number you gave me, Warren." "I'll walk you out," Warren said immediately. "No need," I said, not looking up from the sink where I was rinsing the remaining tea down the drain. "Teresa knows where the door is. She's been using it since she was 12. Teresa lingered for a second, her boots clicking softly on the floor. I heard the rustle of her coat, the small sigh she always gave when she wanted people to ask if she was truly all right. When neither of us spoke, she walked toward the hall. The front door clicked shut. The brass latch, of course, didn't hold. It bounced once, leaving a thin crack of gray afternoon light visible in the mirror at the end of the corridor. Warren stood still for a long moment. I could hear his breath, heavy, slightly nasal, the sound of a man who was preparing an argument but hadn't yet decided which lie was the safest to lead with. "You're being cold," he said quietly, his tone shifting from defensive to slightly wounded. "She's your sister, Lorraine. She has no one else." I dried my hands on the green linen towel. The linen was wearing thin in the middle, the fabric turning translucent from too many washings. "I have 3 packages of chicken in the freezer," I said, turning to face him. "I was going to make the casserole Mitchell likes for when he comes next month, but I suppose we can have one of them tonight." He stared at me, his brow furrowing. He had expected an accusation. He had spent 30 years learning how to navigate my anger, how to wait it out, how to call it hysteria or sensitivity, until I grew too tired to maintain it and apologized for making a scene. My silence, however, was a language he didn't know how to translate. "Lorraine," he started, taking a step toward the counter. "The latch on the front door is loose again, Warren," I said, my voice perfectly level. "If you don't fix it before dark, the wind will keep the hallway cold all night." I walked past him, up the stairs to our bedroom. On the third step from the top, there was a small creak that I had known for 30 years. I stepped right over it. Our bedroom faced north, which meant it never received the direct, forgiving warmth of the afternoon sun. It was always in shadow by 3, the light turning a dull, flat blue against the pale gray walls I had painted myself 3 summers ago. Warren had promised to help, but after he spent 2 hours tape measuring the baseboards and complaining about the quality of the roller sleeves, he had gone down to his workshop to let the first coat dry. I had finished the room alone, working until my wrists ached and the smell of latex paint settled deep into my throat. I sat on the edge of the mattress. The quilt was one my grandmother had made, heavy, pieced together from scraps of old gingham and faded denim. It was dense enough to keep the cold out, but today it felt like lead across my knees. Through the floorboards, I heard the muffled metallic rattle of Warren in the kitchen. He was cleaning up the tea. I knew his movements without seeing them. The heavy, deliberate thud of his work boots, the squeak of the cabinet doors under the sink, the sharp, impatient snap of the trash bin lid. He was working quickly, driven by the frantic energy of a man who believed that if he erased the physical evidence of a mess, the moral complication would vanish with it. Children rarely notice a mother disappearing until something they need disappears with her. Husbands are much the same, though their blindness is more calculated. They don't look too closely at the woman who keeps their life running, because looking closely might require them to acknowledge the cost of their own comfort. At precisely 4 o'clock, the phone on the bedside table began to ring. It was a heavy, cream-colored landline we had kept for 20 years because Warren insisted cell reception in the valley was too unreliable for emergencies. I picked it up on the second ring. "Hello, Mitchell," I said. "Hey, Mom," his voice came through, loud and slightly tinny. There was the familiar background hum of Chicago traffic, the distant shriek of an L train. "You sound tired. Did you get the results from the clinic?" "They rescheduled," I said, smoothing a wrinkle in the gingham quilt. "The machine was down. I have to go back next Thursday." "Unbelievable," Mitchell muttered. I could hear him shifting his phone, probably walking through the glass-walled lobby of his office building. "They make you wait 3 months for an appointment and then can't even keep the equipment running. Did Dad go with you?" "No," I said. "He had things to do here." Downstairs, I heard the soft click of the kitchen extension being lifted. Then Warren's voice cut into the line, warm and robust, completely devoid of the tension that had filled the kitchen 10 minutes earlier. "Hey there, Mitch," Warren said. "I'm here too. Just got in from the garage. How's the weather up there? They saying you're getting that lake effect snow tonight?" "A little bit, Dad," Mitchell said, his tone instantly brightening. My son always spoke to his father with a certain careful eagerness, like a boy hoping to be chosen for a team. "Nothing we can't handle. Hey, Mom, before I forget, Chloe wanted me to ask if you still had that old silver serving platter, the one with the beaded edge. We're hosting her boss for dinner next week, and she wanted to use something classic." "The silver is in the buffet," I said. "It needs polishing. It hasn't been used since your graduation." "I can come get it this weekend," Mitchell said. "Actually, it works out perfectly. Aunt Teresa told me Dad was already planning to drive out to her place on Saturday to help her move those oak filing cabinets from her old office. I figured I could just meet him there and grab the platter. The bedroom felt very still. The blue light from the window seemed to freeze on the glass. "Your father is going to Teresa's on Saturday?" I asked. My voice didn't rise. It remained perfectly flat. A small stone dropped into deep water. There was a brief pause on the line. I heard the faint rustle of Warren's sleeve against the plastic of the downstairs receiver. "Oh," Mitchell said, his tone shifting, a sudden defensive hesitation creeping in. "Yeah, she mentioned it on Sunday when she called to wish Chloe a happy birthday. She said Dad had offered to bring the truck down because her landlord wouldn't let her use the freight elevator after 5. Did she not ask you, Mom?" "We haven't discussed Saturday yet," I said. "Well, you know how Teresa is," Warren broke in quickly, his laugh sounding forced and dry over the wire. "She probably just assumed I was free because I usually am on Saturdays. I told her I'd have to check with your mother first, Mitch. You know how it is. Lorraine's the scheduler around here. If I don't check the calendar, I end up double booking us." Right, Mitchell said, though the ease had gone out of his voice. He was 28, old enough to recognize the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure between his parents, even if he didn't understand the cause. "Anyway, just let me know. If it doesn't work, Chloe can just buy something at Target." "We'll make it work, son," Warren said. "Don't you worry about it. Tell Chloe we'll get that platter to her one way or another." After we hung up, the silence returned, heavier this time. I didn't put the receiver down immediately. I held it to my ear, listening to the hollow dial tone until it turned into that rhythmic, demanding beep that signals a line left open. I heard Warren's footsteps on the stairs. They were slower now, more deliberate. He didn't step over the 3rd stair from the top. It gave a long, high-pitched groan under his weight. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom. He had taken off his flannel overshirt, and he was just in his white undershirt, his arms thick and pale against the dark wood of the frame. He looked like a man who had lived in this house for 30 years, but as I looked at him, I realized I couldn't remember the last time he had looked at me with anything resembling curiosity. "I was going to tell you tonight," he said. He didn't come into the room. He stayed in the threshold, one hand resting on the jamb. "She called on Friday while you were at the grocery store. She was frantic, Lorraine. The landlord is being a real bastard about her moving her things out of the office. She couldn't afford the commercial movers." "You told Mitchell on Sunday," I said. "I didn't tell him anything," Warren said, his voice hardening slightly. "Teresa must have called him. You know how she is. She talks to everyone. She probably just assumed I'd do it because I'm her brother-in-law. Because I'm the only man in this family who actually has a truck." "You told Mitchell you were in the garage just now," I said. "But you were in the kitchen with Teresa." "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked. His eyes narrowed, the red blotches returning to his neck. "Are you keeping a log now?" "I was in the kitchen because she had just arrived. I went out to greet her. Is that a crime?" He was waiting for me to raise my voice. He wanted the release of a fight, the familiar cycle of accusations and tears that would allow him to play the role of the reasonable, long-suffering husband who was only trying to help his wife's difficult family. I stood up from the bed. I walked to the closet, opened the door, and took out the small basket of laundry that needed sorting. "Your blue shirt has a grease stain on the cuff," I said, my back to him. "I'll need to soak it before I wash it." "Lorraine," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying that warning tone he used when he felt I was being stubborn. "Don't do this." "Do what, Warren?" I asked, turning to look at him. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked at the laundry basket in my hands, then at the quiet, orderly room behind me. There was nothing for him to fight. There was no anger to turn back on me. "I'm going to start dinner," I said. I walked past him. As I reached the stairs, my eyes caught the small wooden table in the hallway where we kept the spare keys and the mail. Sitting right beside the porcelain bowl was a small, silver-plated lighter. It was old, the finish worn down to the brass at the corners. It belonged to Teresa. She had given up smoking 5 years ago, or so she told our mother. But as I bent down to look closer, I saw a tiny smudge of gray ash on the polished mahogany of the table, right beneath the wick. It was still fresh enough to smear when I touched it with the tip of my finger. The kitchen was quiet while the chicken baked. I sat at the small table in the corner, the one Warren had bought at an estate sale 20 years ago because he thought the pine legs were sturdy. I had spent 3 days stripping the peeling yellow varnish down to the pale, raw wood, sanding it until my fingers were raw before applying 5 coats of clear wax. It was a good table. It had held up through science projects, spilled grape juice, and the heavy, damp weight of damp laundry baskets. Warren came down the stairs at 6. He had changed into a clean pair of trousers and a dark green sweater I had knitted for him 3 winters ago. He had a habit of wearing things I made when he felt he needed to establish a silent credit with me. It was his way of saying, "Look, I still value what you do." He didn't mention Teresa. Instead, he went straight to the cabinet, pulled out 2 plates, and set them on the table. He did it with an exaggerated care, aligning the edges with the placemats as if he were trying to prove he was contributing to the household labor. "Smells good," he said, his back to me. "You always did know how to season a bird." "It's just salt, pepper, and rosemary," I said, "the same way I've done it since we were married." "Well, consistency is a virtue," he said. He sat down, placing his hands flat on the table. His nails were clean, scrubbed white with the stiff, bristled brush he kept by the basement sink. "Mitchell sounded good on the phone, didn't he? A bit stressed about work, maybe, but that's the city for you. It grinds you down if you let it." "He sounds like a man who is trying very hard to please his wife," I said, rising to take the casserole dish out of the oven. The glass was hot, the heat blooming against my face as I opened the door. "And his father." Warren took his fork and began to trace the grain of the pine wood. "He's a good kid. We did a good job with him, Lorraine. We should be proud of that." "We." It was a word he used like a shield. Whenever there was a difficult conversation, or a bill that was higher than expected, or a family crisis that required hours of quiet, invisible management, the problem belonged to me. But the successes, the polite children, the paid-off mortgage, the green lawn, those were always ours. We ate in a silence that felt different from our usual quiet. Usually, our dinners were filled with the small, dry details of a shared domestic life, the squeak in the clothes dryer, the upcoming oil change, the neighbor's barking dog. Tonight, those details had been stripped away. Every clink of Warren's fork against the stoneware plate sounded like a small, sharp warning. I watched him chew. He ate with a methodical, heavy rhythm, his eyes fixed on the salt shaker. The hardest thing to accept about a long marriage isn't the grand betrayals. It's the realization of how little of you remains in the mind of the person who sleeps 3 inches away from you every night. To Warren, I was like the water heater in the basement, essential, functional, and entirely uninteresting until I stopped working. I have to go to the pharmacy tomorrow morning, I said, setting my fork down. Mother's prescription needs to be refilled. The doctor increased her dosage. Warren paused, a piece of chicken halfway to his mouth. The pharmacy in town, or the big one near the highway? The one in town, I said. Why? No reason, he said quickly, resuming his meal. Just thought if you were going near the highway, you could pick up some of those salt pellets for the water softener. But the town one is fine. Don't worry about it. He was lying. It wasn't a large lie, but it was a clumsy one. He had a habit of widening his eyes slightly when he was trying to appear casual, a physical tic he had never quite managed to control. After dinner, Warren offered to do the dishes. It was a rare gesture, one that confirmed his guilt more clearly than any confession. I didn't argue. I left him in the kitchen with the grease-splattered glass dish and went down to the laundry room in the basement. The basement was Warren's domain. It smelled of damp concrete, WD-40, and the sweet, dry scent of cedar shavings. His tools hung in neat, shadowed rows on the pegboard above his workbench, each one outlined in black marker so he would know if something was missing. I had always stayed out of his workshop. It was the one boundary we had established early in our marriage and never questioned. But the laundry area was mine. The washing machine was old, a heavy white porcelain tub that shook the floorboards when it entered the spin cycle. I took Warren's work trousers from the basket, the dark canvas ones he had worn on Saturday when he told me he was helping a retired colleague clear brush from a pasture. The fabric was stiff, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. Before I threw them into the tub, I reached into the pockets. It was a routine I had performed thousands of times. Usually, I found dry screws, plastic rawl plugs, lint, or wrinkled receipts for 10mm bolts from the hardware store. In the left pocket, there was nothing but a pinch of dry grass. In the right pocket, my fingers brushed against a small, folded slip of paper. I pulled it out. It wasn't a receipt from the local hardware store. It was a cash register receipt from a small diner called the Copper Kettle, located in Greenfield, a town 30 miles west of us, in the opposite direction of the pasture Warren claimed to have been working in. The date was last Saturday, October 14th. The time stamped at the top was 9:14 a.m. The order was simple: 1 coffee, 1 herbal tea, chamomile, 1 corn muffin, warmed, 1 cinnamon swirl toast. The total was $12.42. It had been paid in cash. Warren never drank herbal tea. He claimed it tasted like lawn clippings, and he hated cinnamon. He had a mild allergy to it that made his throat itchy, something I had remembered every time I made apple pies for 30 years. But Teresa loved cinnamon. When we were girls, she used to steal the cinnamon sugar shaker from the pantry and eat it straight from her palm behind the garage. I folded the paper back into its neat, tight square. My fingers were steady, but the coldness in my chest had spread down to my knees, making it hard to stand against the vibration of the washing machine as it began its slow, heavy fill cycle. He hadn't been clearing brush. He had driven 30 miles in the opposite direction in the early morning fog to sit in a vinyl booth and watch my sister tear apart a warm muffin. I heard the basement door open at the top of the stairs. "Lorraine?" Warren's voice called down, the sound echoing flatly against the concrete walls. "Are you doing the darks tonight? I have some work socks in the hamper upstairs if you haven't started yet." I looked at the folded receipt in my palm. The blue ink was slightly faded, the paper soft from being pressed against his thigh all day. "I'm just starting them now, Warren," I called back, my voice remarkably clear without a single tremor. "Bring them down." I slid the receipt into the pocket of my own apron, smoothing the linen over it until the outline disappeared. Warren's boots creaked on the wooden cellar stairs, a slow, heavy rhythm that had once brought me a sense of safety when the kids were small and the house felt too large in the middle of the night. Now, Each step sounded like a physical encroachment. He reached the concrete floor and tossed 3 pairs of thick wool work socks into the open lid of the washing machine. They hit the porcelain with a soft, damp thud. "There you go," he said, leaning against the yellowing side of the dryer. He looked at me, his eyes skating over my apron, my hands, my face, never quite settling anywhere long enough to actually see me. "You look tired, Rainey. You've got those dark circles under your eyes again. You shouldn't stay up so late doing this stuff." "The laundry doesn't do itself, Warren," I said. I reached down and adjusted the dial on the washing machine, the plastic clicking loudly in the small room. I know, he said, his tone carrying that slight patronizing edge of a man who believed his awareness of a chore was the same thing as performing it. "I'm just saying, you put too much on yourself. You always have." He reached out and patted my shoulder, 2 quick, dry taps that felt like an afterthought. It was the same gesture he used when he was leaving a tip on a diner table. "I'm going to head up, watch the news," he said, turning back toward the stairs. "Don't be too long." I watched him go. His back was broad, his hair thinning at the crown in a neat circle that looked like a small target. I felt the folded receipt in my apron pocket, pressing against my hip bone like a cold coin. The most painful part of being replaced isn't the physical absence of the person you loved. It's realizing they have taken your duties, the very things you use to prove your worth, the small, difficult tasks you carried in silence, and handed them to someone else, like a gift. They make a charity of your labor, and they do it while expecting you to thank them for lightening the load. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the granite kitchen counter, the dark wave of tea, and the way their fingers had been locked together, not with the tentative touch of people beginning something new, but with the heavy, settled familiarity of a long-standing arrangement. On Wednesday morning, the frost lay thick on the lawn, turning the grass into stiff, silver needles. I drove into town at 8, the steering wheel cold beneath my leather gloves. The pharmacy, Holloway's Drugs, sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, squeezed between a vacant hardware store and a dry cleaner's that had been closed since the textile mill shut down in the 90s. It was a drafty, narrow building that always smelled of floor wax and menthol. An old brass bell chimed above the door as I pushed it open. Curtis, the pharmacist, was behind the high counter. He was a man of 64, with a fringe of gray hair and a quiet, deliberate way of moving that made him seem more like a librarian than a druggist. He had known my family since my father's first stroke. "Morning, Lorraine," he said, peering over his reading glasses. "Out early today. The frost is real out there, isn't it?" "It is," I said, resting my handbag on the counter. "I came to pick up the serum for Mother. The clinic said they'd have the shipment in by today." Curtis stopped sorting the white paper bags in his wire basket. He looked at me, his eyebrows knitting together in a small, puzzled line. "The serum?" he asked. "Lorraine, Warren picked that up on Monday afternoon." I kept my hands perfectly still on my purse. I felt the skin around my mouth tighten, but I didn't let my expression change. "Monday," I said, keeping my voice light, as if I were simply trying to remember a forgotten errand on a busy schedule. "Oh, I must have lost track of the days." "Yes," Curtis said, turning to a logbook on his desk. He flipped a page, his finger running down the neat, handwritten columns. "He came in around 4. He said your mother was having a difficult week and you were too exhausted to make the drive. He was quite insistent we find the vial from the back before the delivery truck arrived." He looked up, a warm, sympathetic smile softening his face. Teresa was with him, actually, Curtis added, his tone conversational. She was looking at the heating pads. It's really wonderful, Lorraine, how the three of you have rallied around your mother. Most families, well, you know how it is. It usually falls on one person, but Warren and Teresa seem to be handling so much of the running around lately. Yes, I said. The word felt like dry sand in my mouth. They're very supportive. He said she was going to keep the serum at her place, Curtis continued, closing the logbook with a soft puff of dust. Since her apartment is closer to the care home than your place is, he thought it would save you the trip down the county road in the evenings. The county road to the Fairview Assisted Living Facility was a 20-minute drive. I had made that drive every single day for 4 years, rain, snow, or heat. I had never complained about the drive. It was the only time I had to myself, the only time I could sit in the quiet of my own car without Warren's heavy presence or the endless demands of the house. And now they were taking that too. They had used my mother's fading mind and my own assumed exhaustion to build a bridge between them, one that bypassed me entirely. I see, I said. I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet, my fingers clumsy against the leather. Did he pay the copay, Curtis? Or do I need to settle that? Oh no, he took care of it, Curtis said. Put it on his card. He was very efficient about it. Thank you, Curtis, I said. I didn't buy the throat lozenges I had planned to get. I walked out of the pharmacy, the brass bell clashing loudly behind me. The air outside was sharp, catching in my chest. I got into my car, but I didn't start the engine immediately. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the faded brick wall of the dry cleaners opposite. The serum had to be kept cold. It was a biological compound. If it sat in a warm room or a car trunk for more than 3 hours, the proteins would break down, rendering it useless. Teresa's apartment was on the second floor of an old Victorian house with radiator heat that she could never regulate. She was notoriously careless. She forgot to milk her cat. She forgot to pay her electric bill until the lights went out. She forgot her own doctor appointments. There was no way Warren would trust her to keep that medicine at her place, not unless he was spending enough time there to ensure it stayed cold himself. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed, then settled into a low, rumbling idle. Instead of turning toward our house, I shifted the car into drive and headed west, toward the highway that led to Fairview. I needed to see my mother, but more than that, I needed to see what else they had rewritten while I was busy keeping the ledger. Fairview Assisted Living sat on a low hill 3 miles outside the town limits. It had been built in the late 70s, a single-story brick structure surrounded by a perimeter of ornamental pear trees that, in October, dropped small, hard fruit that rotted silently in the grass. Inside, the air was always too warm, smelling of steamed carrots, industrial lavender bleach, and the dry, paper-thin scent of old age. The receptionist, a woman named Monica who had worked there since my mother was admitted 4 years ago, looked up as the automatic doors slid open. She had a half-knitted pink baby blanket resting in her lap. "Lorraine," she said, her expression shifting from professional politeness to a slight, guarded concern. "We didn't expect you today. Your calendar had you down for Friday." "I had some free time," I said, resting my hand on the high counter. "I wanted to bring Mother some of the peppermint patties she likes." Monica adjusted her glasses, her eyes dropping to the baby blanket for a second before she looked back at me. There was a small, uneasy pause, the kind of silence that happens when people know a secret you haven't been told yet. "Lorraine," she said, lowering her voice, "I'm glad you're here, actually. I was going to call you after my shift." "Is something wrong with her medication?" I asked. No, her health is stable, Monica said, leaning forward. But, well, your husband was here yesterday afternoon. He brought a gentleman with him, a notary public named Mr. Vance from the bank. The air in the lobby suddenly felt very thin. A notary? I kept my voice quiet, conversational. I see. For the insurance paperwork, I suppose. That's what Warren said, Monica replied, her eyes scanning my face to see if I was lying or if I truly hadn't known. But they were in your mother's room for nearly an hour. Teresa was there too. I only noticed because your mother got quite agitated afterward. She kept asking Nurse Collins if she was going to have to move out of her room. My mother is easily confused, I said, though my throat felt like it was coated in ash. I know, Monica said, her hand reaching out to touch mine briefly. Her fingers were warm and dry. But usually, you're the one who handles the financial signatures, Lorraine. We have your name on the primary contact sheet. When I asked Warren about it, he said you'd given him the power of attorney last month because the stress was getting to be too much for you. He had told them I was breaking. He had laid the groundwork quietly and politely, presenting himself as the savior of a weary, failing woman. Yes, I lied, my smile small and steady. We decided it was best to share the administrative burden. Warren is very good with the legal details. Well, as long as you're aware, Monica said, looking relieved. I just wanted to make sure. You know how rules are these days. Of course. Thank you, Monica. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward room 114. My shoes made a soft, rhythmic huff-huff against the industrial wool. When you spend your life being the reliable one, people stop asking how you're doing. They assume your strength is a natural resource, like water from a well, and they will keep drawing from it until the bucket comes up dry. They never think about the dark, quiet space at the bottom where the water actually comes from, or how much effort it takes to keep the walls from collapsing inward. I pushed open the door to room 114. My mother, Gloria, was sitting in her high-backed vinyl armchair by the window. She was 79, her body shrunk down to a collection of sharp angles and soft white skin. Her hair, once a thick, dark brown like mine, was now a pale halo of silver that showed her pink scalp beneath. She was watching a squirrel on the lawn, her fingers twitching against the green knitted shawl in her lap. "Mother," I said gently. She turned her head slowly, her blue eyes cloudy with cataracts, but momentarily bright. "Teresa?" she asked, her voice high and thin, like paper tearing. "No, Mother, it's Lorraine." She blinked, her face falling slightly in that small, disappointing way it always did when she realized she hadn't gotten the sister she preferred. Teresa had always been her favorite, the difficult child, the one who needed saving, the one who brought drama and excitement into the quiet of her life. I had merely been the daughter who paid the utility bills and made sure the taxes were filed on time. "Oh," Gloria said, looking back out the window. "Lorraine, you're early. Warren said you were at the doctor. He said your bones are turning to dust." "My bones are fine, Mother," I said, walking over to the bedside table. There was a glass of water with a plastic straw, a half-eaten cup of applesauce, and a small blue carbon copy slip of paper peeking out from beneath her Bible. I reached out and pulled the paper slip toward me. It was a receipt of signature from the county clerk's office, dated yesterday at 2:30 p.m. The document title was printed in small block letters at the top: Quitclaim Deed, Transfer of Real Property. The property listed was the small 2-bedroom cottage on Elm Street, the house my father had built with his own hands. the house my mother still owned, and the house I had spent the last 3 years painting, repairing, and renting out to pay for her care here at Fairview. The transfer was to Teresa, for the sum of $1. "They were here yesterday," Gloria said. Her fingers resumed their twitching against the shawl. "Warren was very nice. He bought me some of those butter crackers I like. He said Teresa needs the house, Rainey. He said she's going to lose her apartment because the landlord is an evil man." "Did he?" I asked. My eyes were fixed on the bottom of the blue paper. There, in my mother's shaky, uneven script, was her signature. Beside it was the neat purple ink stamp of the notary public. "He said you wanted her to have it," Gloria whispered, her voice suddenly small and frightened. She looked up at me, her lower lip trembling. "He said you were tired of managing the tenants. You didn't want the trouble anymore. You did say that, didn't you, Rainey? I didn't want to do the wrong thing." She was looking at me for reassurance, wanting me to absolve her of the guilt of giving away the only asset that was keeping her in this clean, warm facility. If the house was gone, the rental income stopped, and without the rental income, her pension wouldn't cover the monthly fee at Fairview. Warren knew this. He had the financial ledger in his desk downstairs. He knew the numbers as well as I did. He knew that without that cottage, my mother would have to be moved to the state-run facility on the county line, a cold, gray place where the rooms smelled of urine and the staff didn't have time to brush her hair. But Teresa would have her house. I looked at my mother's pale, frightened face. I could have told her the truth. I could have told her that her favorite daughter and my husband were stealing her future from under her, that they were planning to dump her in a state ward so Teresa could have a mortgage-free home in town. But she was 79 and her heart was weak. "Yes, Mother," I said, my voice as soft and steady as a blanket. I reached down and smoothed her silver hair. "I agreed. You did the right thing." She let out a long, shuddering sigh and leaned her head back against the vinyl. "Oh, thank goodness. Warren said you'd be happy about it." I folded the blue carbon slip and tucked it inside my leather glove, right against my palm. I didn't cry on the drive to Elm Street. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel, though my knuckles were white under the leather of my gloves. The cottage sat on a corner lot, half hidden by a sprawling weeping willow my father had planted the year I was born. It was a modest house, only 900 square feet, with clapboard siding painted a pale buttery cream and a small front porch where my mother used to sit with her sewing basket in the summer evenings. As I turned the corner, I saw them. Warren's truck was parked in the driveway, its rear wheels resting on the yellowing grass of the lawn. Teresa's blue sedan was parked behind it, crooked, one tire resting on the curb. The front door of the cottage was wide open. I parked across the street under the deep shade of a maple tree. I didn't get out immediately. I sat and watched through my windshield as Warren carried a cardboard box out of the back of his truck and disappeared through the front door. A minute later, Teresa came out, carrying a broom and a plastic bucket of cleaning supplies. She was laughing, that light, girlish laugh she used when she wanted to make her mistakes seem charming. Some people don't see theft as a crime of taking. They see it as a natural reallocation of things you didn't deserve anyway. To Warren and Teresa, I was merely the custodian of resources they had a more urgent, emotional right to. I got out of the car, closed the door quietly, and walked across the asphalt. The front porch steps had a slight bounce to them. I had told Warren about the soft spot in the wood back in August, but he had said it wasn't worth the price of a pressure-treated board. Now, as I stepped onto the porch, I saw a brand new piece of clean, pale pine had been nailed over the rot. It had been done quickly, the nail head slightly uneven, but it was solid. He had found the time for her. I walked through the open front door. The smell of my father's cedar chest was gone, replaced by the sharp, chemical scent of citrus floor cleaner and Teresa's lavender perfume. In the hallway, Warren was standing on a step stool, a screwdriver in his hand, adjusting the hinges on the coat closet door. Teresa was standing below him, holding a small box of brass screws. The screwdriver scraped against the metal hinge, a dry, grating sound that stopped the moment they heard my footsteps on the hardwood. Warren turned his head. His mouth opened slightly, his brow furrowing as he looked down at me from the stool. Teresa let out a small, sharp gasp, her fingers tightening around the box of screws so quickly that a few of them spilled onto the floor, rolling away into the corners of the hall. "Lorraine," Warren said. He didn't get down from the stool. He held the screwdriver like a shield. What are you doing here?" "I was visiting Mother," I said, my voice quiet and perfectly calm. "She told me she was worried about the draft in the kitchen. I came to see if the storms were sealed." Teresa stepped forward, her face instantly shifting into that mask of fragile, eager-to-please vulnerability she had used on our father for 40 years. "Rainey," she said, her voice trembling. We were going to call you tonight. We wanted to have everything clean first. You know how dusty this place gets when it's empty, and I wanted to get a jump on the scrub down." "You've done a lot of work," I said, my eyes moving over the clean walls, the freshly swept floor, and the brand-new deadbolt lock sitting on the small hall table, still in its plastic packaging. "Even the porch step is fixed." Warren slowly stepped down from the stool. He set the screwdriver on the top step and wiped his hands on his trousers. The red blotches were back on his neck, but his voice was tight, defensive. "The tenants left the place in a state, Lorraine," he said. "We couldn't just let Teresa move in with the doors hanging off. I wanted to make sure it was secure." "It's a very good lock," I said, pointing to the brass deadbolt on the table. "You always did buy the heavy-duty ones for your workshop." "Lorraine, please," Teresa said, her eyes filling with those easy, dramatic tears she could summon at a moment's notice. "Don't be angry with Warren. He was only trying to help me. My landlord. He's giving me until the end of the month, and I had nowhere else to go. You have so much, this beautiful house, Warren, your health. I have nothing, Rainey. Mother wanted me to have this. She wanted me to have a home." She was playing her part beautifully. She was the tragic, neglected younger sister, and I was the cold, wealthy matriarch who grudged her a roof over her head. I looked at Warren. He was watching me, his jaw set, his shoulders squared, as if he were preparing to defend her from my jealousy. He had probably spent the last 3 days telling himself he was a good man, a protector, saving a desperate woman from her cold, uncaring family. "I'm not angry, Teresa," I said. They both blinked, startled by the lack of weight in my voice. They had prepared for a storm. They had built their defenses to withstand a loud, emotional confrontation. They didn't know what to do with a calm afternoon. You're not?" Teresa asked, her voice dropping its theatrical pitch. "No," I said. I walked past them into the living room. The room was empty, the light coming through the clean windows and throwing long, pale rectangles across the floorboards my father had laid. I reached down and touched the windowsill. It was clean, no dust. "Father always said this house was built to last," I said, turning back to face them. They had followed me to the doorway, standing close together, their shoulders almost touching. "He used 3-inch joists under the floor. Most houses this size only have 2. "Lorraine," Warren said, his voice carrying a sudden, nervous edge. "What are you doing? If you have something to say it." I pulled my glove off, my movements slow and deliberate. I reached into my pocket and took out the blue carbon slip of the quitclaim deed. I didn't offer it to them. I simply held it between my fingers, letting them see the color of the paper. "Mother signed this yesterday," I said. Teresa's eyes went to the paper, then to Warren. Warren's chest rose as he took a deep breath, his voice turning hard. "She wanted to do it, Lorraine. It was her decision. She's the owner of this property, and she has the right to do what she wants with it." "Yes," I said, folding the paper back up and slipping it back into my pocket. "She is the owner. But you've been so busy managing her, Warren, that you forgot to look at the paperwork from my father's estate." I looked at the clean, pale floorboards. "When Father died, he didn't leave the house to Mother alone," I said softly. "He left it to Mother and me as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. The deed is in both our names. It has been for 26 years. The silence that fell over the empty room was so absolute that I could hear the wind rustling the dry leaves of the weeping willow outside. Warren's hand, which had been resting on the doorframe, slowly dropped to his side. His face didn't go red this time. It went a strange, sickly gray, the color of wet cement. "What?" he whispered. "Mother only owned 50% of this house, Warren," I said, my voice barely louder than a breath. "And she cannot transfer her share or yours without my signature on the deed. The quitclaim you had her sign yesterday is entirely worthless." I walked toward the doorway. They stood there, frozen, like two statues in an abandoned garden. As I reached them, I looked at the new brass deadbolt sitting on the hall table. "It really is a beautiful lock, Warren," I said, stepping past him into the hall. "I'm glad you installed it. It's going to make the house much easier to sell." I walked out onto the porch, the new pine boards solid and silent beneath my feet. I drove home with the window cracked 3 inches, letting the cold, bitter smell of dead leaves and damp asphalt fill the car. In the rearview mirror, the Elm Street cottage shrank into the background. Warren and Teresa had remained on the porch, 2 small, dark figures standing in the shadow of my father's weeping willow. They hadn't followed me to the car. They hadn't yelled. The truth had acted like a sudden drop in cabin pressure, leaving them gasping for air in the quiet afternoon. When I reached our house, I didn't go inside immediately. I sat in the driveway, looking at the 2-story colonial I had spent 32 years maintaining. Every shrub had been planted by my hands. Every window screen had been washed and stored in the garage every November, then reinstalled every April. I knew the exact day the furnace would begin to clatter, and I knew how to bleed the radiators to keep the bedrooms warm. I had held this structure together with nothing but routine and sheer, stubborn willpower. And yet, as I sat there, the house looked entirely unfamiliar. It looked like a museum of someone else's life. Some men don't leave their marriages all at once. They steal them away, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, until there is nothing left but the empty shell of a house and a wife who has spent 30 years keeping the heat on. They let you believe you are partners, while they quietly dismantle the foundation beneath your feet. I went inside, hung my coat on the velvet-covered hanger, and went into the kitchen. I didn't turn on the lights. The gray, late-afternoon light was enough to see by. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, watching the blue ring of the gas flame flicker into life. Warren came home 40 minutes later. The front door didn't click. It swung open with a heavy, hollow bang that rattled the small mirror in the hall. He didn't take off his boots. He walked straight into the kitchen, his steps loud and aggressive on the wood floor. He smelled of cold air and old tobacco, a habit he had supposedly given up 15 years ago, but one he always returned to when he was cornered. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen island, his hands gripping the granite counter until his knuckles turned white. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" he said. His voice was low, vibrating with a quiet, ugly anger that he had kept bottled up for years. "I'm not clever, Warren," I said, not looking at him. I was watching the steam begin to rise from the spout of the kettle. "I just read the documents I sign, and I remember my father." "Your father has been dead for 12 years, Lorraine," he snapped, his hand coming down on the granite with a sharp, hollow slap. "And that cottage has been sitting there, barely breaking even, while Teresa is drowning. She's your sister, she's family, and you're going to let her go to a state shelter because of some 26-year-old legal loophole?" "It isn't a loophole, Warren, it's a deed," I said. "And the cottage doesn't barely break even. The rent from the tenants paid for Mother's care at Fairview. You know that. You've seen the ledger." Warren let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. He took his hands off the counter and stepped closer to me, his shadow falling over the stove. "The ledger," he said, his tone turning into something cold and mocking. "You and your damn ledger. You think everything in life can be balanced like a checkbook, don't you, Lorraine? You think if you just scrub the floors clean enough and keep the bills paid, nobody's allowed to be unhappy." "I'm not talking about happiness, Warren. I'm talking about Mother's care," I said, turning the gas off as the kettle began to whistle. The sound died away slowly, leaving the kitchen suffocatingly quiet. "Without the rent from Elm Street, her pension won't cover Fairview. They'll move her to the county home by Christmas. Is that what you want?" Warren didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and slid one out. He didn't light it. He just rolled the white paper cylinder between his thumb and forefinger, his eyes fixed on the kettle. "Fairview is paid up through December," he said quietly. "Yes, because of the rent." "No, Lorraine," he said, looking up at me, his eyes dark and entirely empty of the man I had married. "The rent hasn't been enough for 6 months. The facility raised their rates in April. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd panic. I've been supplementing the payments." A small, cold knot began to form in my stomach. "Supplementing them?" I asked. "With what?" "With our savings," he said. He said it so casually, as if he were telling me he had bought a different brand of bread. "The joint savings?" I asked. My hand was still resting on the cold handle of the kettle. "The account for our retirement?" "There is no retirement account, Lorraine," he said. He didn't look guilty. He looked tired, his shoulders slumping as he finally admitted the truth he had been carrying in the dark. "I had to clear it out in August." The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly. The blue flame of the stove had left a faint yellow ring on the burner, and I found myself staring at it, unable to look at him. $82,000, I whispered. "We had $82,000 in that account, Warren. I saved every penny of that from my sewing work and the garden sales. We were going to use that for the travel we planned." "Teresa's boutique was failing," he said, his voice rising in defense, his tone turning sharp again. "The creditors were going to take her car, her furniture, everything. She was going to be left with nothing, Lorraine. I couldn't just stand by and watch her drown. I took the money as a loan. She's going to pay us back." "A loan," I said, "to a woman who hasn't held a job for more than 6 months in her entire life." "She's trying!" he yelled, the sound of his voice shattering the quiet of the house. "She's trying, and she's fragile, Lorraine. You're like iron. Nothing breaks you. You don't need the help. You don't need the comfort.
You just keep going, like a machine, while she's barely holding on."
He was looking at me with something that looked very much like hatred. He hated me for my strength, because my strength made his weakness look small. He had spent months, perhaps years, convincing himself that stealing from our future was a noble act because he was giving it to the woman who made him feel like a hero.
"She's going to move into the cottage, Lorraine," he said, his voice dropping back into a tight, hard whisper. "And we're going to sign the deed over to her. We have to. If we don't, she has to declare bankruptcy, and the bank will come after the loan I co-signed for her boutique. They'll put a lien on this house." He stood there, his chest heaving, waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the tears, the screaming, the collapse that would allow him to take control of the room again. I looked at the small, silver-plated lighter sitting on the hallway table, just beyond the kitchen door. The smudge of ash was still there, dark and permanent against the mahogany. "I see," I said. I turned back to the counter, took 2 mugs from the shelf, and poured the hot water over the tea bags. The steam rose, smelling of chamomile and nothing else. "You should take your boots off, Warren," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You're tracking mud onto the linoleum." Warren stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time, his boots still on, watching me transition from the kettle to the cupboard. He was waiting for the second shoe to drop, for the sudden shift from quiet compliance to the screaming match he had prepared himself for. But I didn't give it to him. I simply set his tea on the corner of the island, took my own cup, and walked out into the living room. I heard him finally grunt, the heavy thud of his work boots hitting the floor one after the other, followed by the wet, scraping sound of him pushing them onto the plastic tray by the door. He didn't follow me. He stayed in the kitchen, the low clatter of a fork against a plate telling me he was eating the cold leftovers straight from the dish. A husband who has spent years hiding his life from his wife is terrified of her silence. To him, silence isn't peace. It's a blank sheet of paper where she is writing down his failures, one by one, waiting for the right moment to present the bill. He would rather have the screaming. In a fight, he can justify his anger. In the quiet, he is forced to listen to the echo of his own voice. I sat in the dark of the den, the steam from my chamomile tea rising and disappearing into the cold air of the room. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't read. I just watched the headlights of passing cars sweep across the floral wallpaper, illuminating the framed photographs of Mitchell's graduation, our trip to the Grand Canyon 20 years ago, and the small, hand-colored portrait of my parents on their wedding day. We slept in the same bed that night, but we lay on opposite edges of the mattress, the vast, cold expanse of 32 years of marriage stretching between us like a frozen lake. Every time he shifted, the springs groaned beneath his weight, and I lay perfectly still, my eyes open in the dark, counting the seconds between his breaths. On Thursday morning, I waited until Warren's truck pulled out of the driveway at 7:30. He had a shift at the water treatment plant until 4. As soon as the sound of his engine faded down the hill, I went to the hall closet, put on my good wool coat, and took my handbag. I didn't drive to the bank. I drove to the county seat, 12 miles west, where the old brick courthouse stood in the center of a grassy square. Across the street from the courthouse, in a narrow 2-story building sandwiched between a bakery and a notary office, was the law firm of Raymond and Associates. Raymond had been my father's attorney. He was 70 now, his shoulders rounded under a tweed jacket that always smelled faintly of peppermint candies and old paper. He had helped me settle my father's estate, and he was the one who had made sure my mother's name was protected when we moved her into Fairview. "Lorraine," he said, rising from his heavy oak desk to shake my hand. His palm was dry and spotted with age. "You should have called, dear. I could have had the girl put on a fresh pot of coffee." "I don't need coffee, Raymond," I said,
sitting in the green leather chair opposite his desk. "I need you to look at some property records for me." He sat back down, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he looked at me with that gentle, slightly paternal curiosity that older men in small towns always reserve for women they've known since childhood. "Elm Street?" he asked. "No," I said, reaching into my handbag. I pulled out the copy of our home's deed, the primary residence, and laid it on the green blotter. "I need to know if there are any active liens or secondary mortgages on my home." Raymond's expression shifted, the softness leaving his eyes, replaced by the sharp, professional focus of a man who had spent 40 years watching families tear themselves apart over money. "Why would you ask that, Lorraine? Did Warren take out a home equity line?" "He told me he co-signed a loan for Teresa's boutique," I said, keeping my voice level, my hands folded in my lap. "He said the bank might come after our house if she goes bankrupt." Raymond stared at me for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He reached for his telephone, dialed a 3-digit extension, and spoke quietly to his secretary. "Debbie, run a title search on the Miller property. Yes, the primary on Cedar Ridge. See if there are any active deeds of trust filed in the last 6 months. Print them out for me." He hung up, then leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Lorraine," he said softly, "you're the primary owner on Cedar Ridge, aren't you? Your father gave you the down payment from his insurance policy." "Yes," I said. "The deed is in both our names, but the original mortgage was paid off 5 years ago. We had a party in the backyard. Warren burned the paperwork in the grill." 5 minutes later, Debbie entered the room, holding a single manila folder. She set it on Raymond's desk, gave me a small, pitying look that made my throat tighten, and left without a word. Raymond opened the folder. He didn't read the whole document. He knew exactly where to look. His finger ran down the page, stopping near the bottom of a certified copy of a deed of trust, filed with the county clerk on September 12th. He sighed, a long, dry sound that smelled of peppermint. "Warren didn't just co-sign a personal loan, Lorraine," Raymond said, his voice dropping into a register that made the room feel very cold. "He took out a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit for $75,000. My hands didn't shake. I kept them folded in my lap, the leather of my handbag smooth beneath my fingers. "A second mortgage," I repeated. "Yes," Raymond said, "secured by your primary residence. To do that, the bank requires the signature of both title holders." He turned the document around and slid it across the green blotter toward me. At the bottom of the page, there were 2 signature lines. On the first line, Warren's signature was bold, thick, and familiar, the same signature he used on our tax returns and the registration for his truck. On the second line, my name was written in a neat, slanted script. The L had the small, elegant loop I had used since high school. The I was dotted with a precise, round press of the pen. It was a beautiful signature. It looked exactly like mine. But I had been in Chicago on September 12th, visiting Mitchell's new apartment. I had spent the entire afternoon helping Chloe hang curtains while Warren stayed home to clean the gutters. "Lorraine," Raymond said, his voice very quiet, very careful. "Did you sign this document?" I looked at the beautiful forged script. If I said no, Raymond would have to report it to the county prosecutor. Warren would be arrested for bank fraud, grand theft, and forgery. The bank would freeze everything, and the scandal would rip through our small town, through Mitchell's career, through what little remained of my mother's peace. If I said yes, I would be legally bound to a $75,000 debt on a house I had spent 30 years building. a debt Warren had given to my sister so she could buy cashmere cardigans and rent a boutique she didn't know how to run. Raymond was watching me, his pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. "Lorraine?" he asked again. "Is that your signature?" I looked out the window at the courthouse square, where the dry oak leaves were chasing each other across the grass in the cold October wind. Raymond's pen remained poised over his yellow legal pad, the gold nib catching the weak gray light from the window. He was a man who had made his living from the small, quiet disasters of domestic life. He knew that a paused breath or a long silence was often more telling than a loud denial. "Lorraine?" he asked again, his voice dropping into a gentle, cautious murmur. "Is that your signature?" I looked at the neat, slanted script. I touched the white paper copy, my finger resting on the loop of the L that Warren had drawn so carefully. He must have practiced it for hours, perhaps on the back of old utility bills or on scrap paper down in his workshop while the radio played. He had always been good with his hands. "I need to check my calendar, Raymond," I said, my voice steady, though my chest felt as if it were being squeezed by a cold iron band. I was out of town for a few days in September. Mitchell had some trouble with his water heater, and I went to help. I need to make sure of the dates before I say anything for certain. Raymond didn't look convinced. He took off his reading glasses and let them hang from the black cord around his neck. "Lorraine," he said, leaning closer, "if you didn't sign this, and we don't report it to the bank immediately, you may lose the right to contest the validity of the deed of trust. Once the first payment is missed, the bank's legal team moves quickly, especially with secondary mortgages. They don't have the patience of a primary lender." "I understand," I said, folding the document and sliding it into my handbag. "I just need 24 hours. I'll call you tomorrow morning." He sighed, his shoulders rising and falling under the tweed jacket. 24 hours, Lorraine. No more. If Warren has done what I think he's done, well, you need to protect yourself. He isn't the man you married 30 years ago." "None of us are the people we were 30 years ago, Raymond," I said, rising from the leather chair. "We just have more practice at hiding it." I drove back to our town, but I didn't turn towards Cedar Ridge. Instead, I drove down Main Street, past the empty brick storefronts and the diner with the peeling vinyl stools, until I reached the corner of 4th. There, occupying the ground floor of an old bank building, was Willow and Loom. The boutique was Teresa's dream. She had spent years complaining that our town had no culture, no place for women of taste to buy things that weren't mass-produced. The display window was immaculate, a single pale linen dress draped over a driftwood branch, surrounded by expensive soy candles and bars of French lavender soap that cost $12 apiece. I pushed the heavy glass door open. A small brass bell chimed, a light, cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place. The air inside was warm and thick with the scent of sandalwood and expensive wool. Teresa was sitting behind the counter, a high-gloss white structure that looked like it belonged in a gallery in Chicago rather than a struggling mill town. She was drinking coffee from a ceramic mug, her feet tucked under her on a plush velvet stool. She froze when she saw me. The mug stopped halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening as she took in my wool coat, my leather gloves, and the quiet, heavy way I closed the door behind me. "Rainey," she said, her voice dropping its usual breathless, girlish register. I thought you'd be at home. Warren said you were going to do the winterizing on the garden beds today." "The frost has already taken the dahlias," I said, walking slowly toward the shelves. I picked up a small jar of organic honey with a hand-lettered label. $24. There's no use winterizing what's already dead. Teresa slipped off her stool, her hand smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse, the one she had bought in September, right around the time the second mortgage was filed. "Look, Rainey," she began, her tone defensive, her shoulders squaring. "If you're here to talk about the cottage again, I've already spoken to Warren. He's going to handle the paperwork. I know you're upset about the deed, but it's what Mother wanted. You have to let her have some say in her own life." "I'm not here about the cottage, Teresa," I said. I set the honey jar back on the shelf, making sure the label faced perfectly forward. I was just at the county seat. I had a very nice talk with Raymond. Teresa's face didn't just go pale, it went entirely blank, the artificial animation she usually carried vanishing in an instant. "Raymond?" she whispered. "Yes," I said, walking toward the counter. I rested my gloved hands on the white gloss surface. He showed me the deed of trust for the second mortgage Warren took out on our house. $75,000. It was filed in September. She took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of the velvet stool. She reached out and grabbed the edge of the register to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. I didn't know about that," she stammered, her eyes darting toward the door as if she were hoping Warren's truck would suddenly pull up outside. "I swear, Rainey, I didn't know he took it out on your house. He told me it was a private loan. He said he had some investments he was cashing in." "Warren doesn't have investments, Teresa. He has a pension from the water plant and $82,000 in our joint savings that is now gone," I said, my voice dropping into a whisper that seemed to absorb the warm, scented air of the boutique. "And he has our house, the house my father helped us buy." "He wanted to do it," she cried suddenly, her voice rising, thin and sharp, breaking the quiet of the shop. "He insisted, Lorraine. He's been telling me since last Christmas that he was going to take care of me. He said you guys had more than enough, that you were just sitting on the equity because you were too stubborn to do anything with it. He said you wouldn't even notice." Since last Christmas. The words hung in the air between us like a physical blow. Last Christmas, Warren had given me a new set of mixing bowls and a fleece bathrobe. He had spent the holiday afternoon in the den, watching football with Mitchell while I washed the roasting pan and cleared the table. I remembered looking in on him through the doorway, thinking how peaceful he looked, how settled. And all the while, he had been planning this. For nearly a year he had been looking at our home, at our savings, at my mother's cottage, and deciding how to dismantle them for her. "He said you didn't need it," Teresa whispered, her eyes filling with tears that this time looked genuine, driven by the cold, ugly panic of a child who had finally realized the stove was hot. "He said you were like a rock, Rainey. He said you didn't have any feelings to hurt." I looked at her, my little sister, the one I had helped dress for her first dance, the one I had bailed out of debt 3 times before I finally stopped answering her late-night calls. She was 48 years old, but she still looked at the world like a teenager who believed that if she cried hard enough, someone would eventually clean up the glass. "A rock doesn't feel the hammer, Teresa," I said, my voice quiet and perfectly calm, "but it still turns to sand if you hit it long enough." I turned toward the door, my coat brushing against a display of expensive wool blankets. "Rainey, wait!" she called out, her voice cracking. What are you going to do?" I paused, my hand on the heavy brass handle of the glass door. "I'm going to go home," I said, "and I'm going to wait for my husband." The drive back to Cedar Ridge was the longest 20 minutes of my life, yet it passed in a strange, frictionless blur. The afternoon was dying, the sky bruised with heavy, purple clouds that promised rain before dark. I drove with my hands at 10 and 2,
my eyes fixed on the gray asphalt as it wound through the hills, my mind perfectly, terrifyingly clear. When I got home, the house was cold. I didn't turn on the thermostat. I went into the kitchen, took off my coat and gloves, and hung them in their usual places. Then, because my hands needed something to do, I began to make dinner. I peeled potatoes, the brown skin curling away from the sharp blade of the parer in long, unbroken ribbons. I dropped them one by one into a pot of cold, salted water. I chopped onions, my eyes stinging, the tears running down my cheeks without any corresponding sadness. It was just a chemical reaction. It was just the onions. At 4:15, the telephone on the wall began to ring. I didn't answer it. I stood by the sink, the potato parer in my hand, and watched the red light on the answering machine blink. After the fourth ring, the machine clicked, and Warren's voice filled the quiet kitchen. He sounded breathless, his words clipped and high-pitched. "Lorraine? Are you there? Pick up if you're there. Teresa called me. She said, 'Look, don't do anything stupid, Lorraine. I'm leaving the plant now. I'll be home in 10 minutes. Just stay there. Don't call anyone.'" The machine clicked off. The red light resumed its slow, steady blinking. I went back to the potatoes. A marriage is a complicated structure, built of millions of small, invisible transactions. You trade your youth for security, your silence for peace, your labor for a shared name. You spend decades believing the foundation is solid because the walls are still standing and the roof doesn't leak. But sometimes the rot has been there from the very beginning, eating away at the beams in the dark, while you were busy polishing the silver. At 4:30, Warren's truck roared into the driveway. He didn't park in his usual spot by the garage. He left the truck crooked, the driver's side door swinging open as he scrambled out. The front door slammed, the loose brass latch rattle-clanging against the frame. He didn't take off his boots. He burst into the kitchen, his face flushed, his chest heaving under his work jacket. He looked small. In the 32 years I had known him, I had always thought of him as a large man, broad-shouldered, solid, a presence that filled a room. But as he stood there in the dim kitchen light, his shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting around the room like an animal looking for an exit. "You went to see Raymond," he said, his voice coming out in a dry, ragged gasp. He didn't try to deny it. He knew the game was over. "And you went to the boutique." Teresa was hysterical, Lorraine. She was practically having a heart attack. "The potatoes are nearly ready," I said, not looking at him. I turned the burner on under the pot, the blue flame clicking into life with a dry tack, tack, tack. "I'm making a meatloaf." "To hell with the meatloaf," he yelled, taking a step toward me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Are you trying to ruin me? Is that what this is? Some kind of revenge because I helped her?" "Ruin you, Warren?" I asked, turning slowly to face him. I leaned back against the counter, my hands resting on the edge of the sink. "You took $75,000 out on our home. You forged my name on a deed of trust. You took $82,000 of our savings. And you've been planning it since last Christmas. I didn't ruin you. You did this yourself." The anger went out of him all at once, like a balloon pricked by a needle. His shoulders slumped, and he took a step back, his eyes dropping to the floor. He looked at his muddy boots, then at the pot of potatoes on the stove. "I was going to pay it back," he whispered. He sounded like a child who had been caught stealing from his mother's purse, offering the same tired, useless explanation. "The boutique, she was going to make a go of it, Lorraine. She just needed a little runway. Once she started turning a profit, I was going to put the money back in the savings. I had a schedule." "A schedule," I said. "And what about the payments on the second mortgage?"
Did you have a schedule for those, too? He didn't answer. He couldn't. You spend 30 years believing your husband is a giant, the pillar holding up your world, only to realize he is just a frightened, weak man who broke the window and is now terrified of the dark. Raymond said it's a felony, Warren said, his voice trembling now, the real, raw panic finally showing through his bluster. He looked up at me, his eyes wet with tears of self-pity. He said if you go to the police, they'll arrest me. I'll lose my job at the plant, Lorraine. I'll lose my pension. We'll lose everything. Is that what you want? To see your husband in a cell? He was appealing to my loyalty, the same loyalty I had given him for 3 decades, the loyalty he had used to secure the loan he had given to my sister. He believed that because I had always accommodated his selfishness, I would accommodate this too. He believed my endurance was infinite. The bank called while you were on your way home, Warren, I said softly. He froze. His eyes locked onto mine, his mouth opening slightly. The bank? He whispered. Yes, I said, turning back to the stove. I took a wooden spoon and stirred the potatoes, the water bubbling up around the white chunks. A man named Mr. Vance. He said there was a problem with the first payment on the second mortgage, the one that was due on October 1st. Warren's face went from flushed to a sickly, translucent white. October 1st? He stammered. But I thought I gave her the checkbook for that account. She said she'd handle the first 3 months. She didn't handle it, Warren, I said, my voice as quiet and cold as the frost on the lawn. She used the money to buy the velvet stools for her shop. The payment bounced. Mr. Vance said we are officially 30 days in default. I set the wooden spoon down on the counter. And tomorrow morning, I said, the bank is sending a representative to inspect the property. Warren didn't eat his meatloaf. He sat at the kitchen table, his fork resting on the edge of his plate, his eyes fixed on the blank screen of his cell phone. Every few minutes, he would redial Teresa's number, his thumb pressing the screen with a frantic, trembling rhythm. He would hold the phone to his ear, wait through the silence, and then slowly drop his hand back to the table. She's not answering, he whispered, his voice thin and hollow in the quiet of the dining room. She's turned her phone off. Lorraine, she's not answering me. She has a lot of inventory to organize, Warren, I said, chewing my food slowly. It was a good meatloaf, moist, seasoned with the thyme I had dried from my own garden back in August. And she has the cottage to sweep. How can you eat? He asked, his voice cracking as he looked at me. There was a genuine, desperate horror in his eyes now, the look of a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet was nothing but a thin layer of ice over deep water. We're 30 days in default. The bank is coming tomorrow. If they inspect the property and see, if they realize what's happening, they'll call the loan, Lorraine. They'll accelerate the debt. We'll have to pay the entire $75,000 immediately, or they'll foreclose. I know, I said, setting my fork down. I wiped my mouth with the green linen napkin. You have that money, he said suddenly, leaning across the table, his eyes bright with a dangerous, frantic hope. He reached out, his fingers hovering near my hand but not quite touching it. The $5,000 your father left you in that separate savings account, the one at the credit union. We can use that to clear the default, Lorraine. It will buy us 30 days. Just 30 days to get Teresa to sell some of her stock or to get a loan from someone else. I looked at him, my husband of 32 years, a man who had forged my name to steal $75,000 from our home, now asking me to give him the last $5,000 my father had left me to protect my own security. He didn't see the monstrousness of the request. To him, it was simply another domestic resource to be liquidated, another sacrifice I was expected to make to keep his world from collapsing. "No, Warren," I said. "Lorraine, please," he begged, his voice dropping into a ragged, pathetic whine. "It's our house. They'll take our house. You'd let them take our home just to punish me?" "That money is for Mother's winter coat and her physical therapy," I said, rising to clear the plates. "And it's for my lawyer's retainer. I'm not using it to pay for Teresa's velvet stools." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He had no words left. He had spent his entire life believing my patience was a well that would never run dry, and now that he had lowered his bucket and found only dust, he didn't know how to survive the thirst. Friday morning arrived with a cold, steady rain that turned the gravel of our driveway into a slick, gray soup. The wind was coming from the north, rattling the loose storm windows and sending wet, yellow birch leaves sticking to the glass. At precisely 9 o'clock, a neat silver sedan pulled up to the curb. The woman who got out was named Denise. She was in her early 40s, wearing a sensible dark blue trench coat and carrying a black leather portfolio zipped tight against the rain. She had the sharp professional posture of a woman who had spent her career in the mid-level management of financial institutions, polite, efficient, and entirely immune to the emotional dramas of defaulting homeowners. Warren opened the door before she could knock. He was wearing his good corduroy shirt, his hair brushed wetly back from his forehead, his face stretched into a tight, frantic grin that made him look like a man with a fever. Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice too loud, too hearty. "I'm Warren Miller. Come in out of the rain." "Denise Vance," she said, stepping into the hallway and wiping her sensible black leather shoes on the mat. She shook his hand with a quick, firm squeeze, her eyes already skating over the wallpaper, the light fixtures, the ceiling, measuring the value of the asset she had been sent to protect. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I'm sorry about the weather." "Oh, it's just autumn in the valley," Warren said, gesturing toward the living room. "We're very proud of this place. We've kept it in great shape, reshingled the roof 3 years ago, copper plumbing throughout. No drafts. Just a little temporary cash flow glitch with the boutique. You know how it is. My sister-in-law is just getting her feet under her." "I understand," Denise said, unzipping her portfolio and pulling out a clipboard with a stack of computerized forms. "But when a secondary lien enters 30-day default on the very first payment, our regional office requires a physical asset verification. It's standard procedure to ensure the collateral hasn't been compromised." Of course," Warren said, his hand hovering near her elbow, guiding her toward the dining room. "We have nothing to hide here. It's a solid home." I was standing by the sideboard, holding a fresh pot of coffee. I had set out 3 of our good porcelain cups, the ones with the delicate blue cornflower pattern my mother had given us for our 10th anniversary. "Good morning, Denise," I said. She turned, her professional smile softening slightly as she took in my knitted cardigan, the neat bun of my hair, and the quiet, orderly space of the dining room. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," she said. "It smells wonderful in here. Is that cinnamon?" "It is," I said, pouring a cup of coffee and holding it out to her. "I made some coffee cake. Please sit down for a moment before you start your walk-through. It's cold out there today." "Thank you," Denise said, sitting at the pine table. She set her clipboard on the wood, her pen resting on the top page. "We appreciate your cooperation. Usually these visits are, well, they can be quite difficult." "I'm sure they are," I said, sitting opposite her. Warren remained standing in the archway, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting between Denise and me like a man watching a bomb fuse burn. Actually, Denise, I was quite surprised to hear about the inspection. I only saw the deed of trust for the first time yesterday afternoon. Denise paused, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. She set it back down, her eyes narrowing slightly with that sudden, sharp focus that belongs to people who deal with legal liabilities. "Yesterday?" she asked. "Yes," I said, smoothing my apron over my lap. "My father's old attorney, Raymond, pulled the county filings for me. I was out of town in Chicago on September 12th, you see, helping my son with some apartment maintenance. I didn't realize Warren had secured the line of credit against our primary residence until Raymond showed me the signature." In the archway, I heard the sharp, sudden intake of Warren's breath. The sound of his boots shifting on the hardwood was like the cracking of dry twigs in a silent forest. Denise's eyes shifted slowly from my face to Warren's. She didn't look angry. She looked intensely, professionally alert. Her hand went to her clipboard, her fingers touching the edge of the certified copy of the deed of trust. "Mrs. Miller," Denise said, her voice dropping into a very quiet, very precise register. "Are you telling me you were not present at the bank on September 12th when this document was notarized?" The silence in the dining room was so absolute that I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the wind-up clock on the mantelpiece 3 rooms away. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the glass, a steady gray curtain that seemed to seal the 3 of us inside a small, suffocating box. I reached into my cardigan pocket. My fingers brushed against the smooth, folded paper of the Amtrak ticket I had kept in my dresser drawer. I laid it on the pine table right beside Denise's gold-nibbed pen. Beside it, I placed a small, yellowed receipt from Field's Drapery Shop on Michigan Avenue, dated September 12th at 2:14 p.m. "I was in Chicago, Denise," I said, my voice barely louder than the patter of the rain. "My son Mitchell had just moved into his new place, and I spent the weekend helping him hem the living room curtains. I didn't return to the valley until the evening of the 15th. Denise didn't look at the ticket immediately. She stared at me, her face pale, her professional composure hardening into something cold and sharp. She was a regional compliance auditor. She knew that what she was looking at was no longer a simple foreclosure case. It was a multi-layer banking liability. "The notary stamp on this deed of trust," Denise said, her voice dropping into a flat, dangerous whisper, "belongs to Arthur Vance. He's the manager of our local branch here on Main Street." "Arthur is a friend of Warren's," I said. "They play golf together on Thursdays. He was at our house for New Year's Eve." In the archway, Warren made a strange, wet sound in his throat, a choked gasp that sounded like a man drowning in shallow water. He took a step into the dining room, his hands trembling as he reached toward the table. "Lorraine, please," he whispered, his voice cracking, the bluster entirely gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror that made him look 70 years old. "Miss Vance, it was just a misunderstanding. My wife, she's forgetful lately. She's been having these senior moments. We talked about the loan, I swear we did. She told me to go ahead and handle it because she didn't want the hassle of coming into the branch." He was trying the last, most desperate lie. He was going to present me as a senile, confused old woman to save himself and his golfing partner from a federal fraud charge. I looked up at him. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the sharp, hot sting of betrayal. I felt only a vast, gray emptiness. The realization that the man I had shared a bed with for 32 years would gladly dismantle my sanity to protect his own skin. "I'm not forgetful, Warren," I said.
and we never spoke about the loan. Denise slowly stood up. She didn't touch her coffee cup. She took the Amtrak ticket, the drapery receipt, and the certified copy of the deed of trust and slid them into her black leather portfolio. She zipped it closed with a sharp, metallic rasp that sounded like a knife sliding into a sheath. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Miller," Denise said, her eyes fixed entirely on me, ignoring Warren as if he were nothing but an empty chair in the corner of the room. "And thank you for the coffee. I have what I need for my report." "Miss Vance, wait," Warren begged, taking a step toward her, his hands outstretched. "We can work this out. I can get the money. I can talk to Arthur. We can restructure the debt." "Mr. Miller," Denise said, her voice dropping into a register that was as cold and hard as the concrete outside. "Do not contact Arthur Vance, and do not come into the Main Street branch. Our regional legal counsel will be in touch with you and your attorney by Monday morning. Good day." She walked down the hallway, her sensible black shoes clicking softly on the hardwood. The front door opened, the brass latch giving its familiar rattle, and then the door clicked shut. We stood in the dining room, the silence returning like water filling a hole in the sand. Warren stood by the table, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, his head bowed. He looked at the 2 blue cornflower cups, the steam still rising from the hot coffee, and then he slowly turned his head to look at me. "You did it," he whispered, his voice shaking with a quiet, venomous rage that had been building since I walked into the kitchen yesterday afternoon. "You've actually done it. You've destroyed our life, Lorraine. You've put your own husband in prison. For what? For some money? For a house?" "I didn't put you in prison, Warren," I said, rising to take the coffee pot back to the kitchen. "You walked in there yourself. You signed my name. You took the money. You gave it to Teresa." "She needed it!" he screamed, his voice breaking, the sound echoing flatly against the pine walls. "She was drowning, Lorraine, and you're like a stone. You don't feel anything. You don't need anyone. You've spent 30 your years making me feel like I was nothing but a utility bill in this house, and now you're going to let them take everything I have because I wanted to help someone who actually appreciated me." It was the final, ugly truth of our marriage. He had spent decades feeling small because my competence, my silence, my quiet labor had highlighted his own mediocrity. He had run to Teresa because Teresa was weak, because her weakness made him feel powerful, and because her constant crises allowed him to play the role of the big, generous man he had never been able to be with me. His phone, sitting on the corner of the table, suddenly vibrated. The sharp, buzzing sound was like an electric shock in the quiet room. Warren gasped, his hand darting out to grab the phone as if he were hoping it was Teresa calling to tell him it was all a bad dream. He unlocked the screen. He read the text. I watched his face. I watched the skin around his eyes tighten, the color leaving his lips, his mouth falling open as he read the words on the screen. He looked at the phone for a long, horrible moment, and then his hand slowly dropped to his side, the phone slipping from his fingers and hitting the pine table with a dull clatter. "Warren?" I asked. He didn't answer. He looked out the window at the gray rain falling on the weeping willow across the street, his eyes blank and completely hollow. "She's gone," he whispered. "Gone?" She took the cash from the register," he said, his voice dropping into a flat, dead register. "She cleared out the remaining stock from the boutique last night. She's driving to her ex-husband's place in Ohio. She said she can't handle the stress. She said she's sorry, but she has to protect herself.
He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely empty, like a child who had built a house of cards, only to watch the wind blow it away before he could even show his father. "She left me, Lorraine," he whispered. "She's gone." I washed the blue cornflower cups in the sink, my hands moving through the warm, soapy water with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Behind me, in the dining room, Warren remained frozen at the table. He hadn't moved since he dropped his phone. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, his chin tucked into his collar, staring at the empty space where Denise had been sitting an hour before. "I gave her everything," he whispered, his voice sounding like dry paper sliding across concrete. "I risked my job. I risked my name. I took the savings we built, Lorraine, and she cleared the register. She didn't even leave enough for the electric bill on the shop." "Teresa never did like to pay bills, Warren," I said, rinsing the soap from the porcelain. I set the cups on the wire rack to dry, their blue flowers shiny under the kitchen light. "She preferred to let other people handle the math." "How could she do it?" he asked, his voice rising slightly, a pathetic, trembling note of confusion creeping in. "I loved her, Lorraine. I would have done anything for her. How could she just jump in a truck and leave me here to face the bank alone?" "She didn't love you, Warren," I said, turning around to lean against the sink. I dried my hands on the green towel. "She loved the rescue. She loved the drama of being saved. But once the water got too deep, she realized you were going to drag her down with you. So she used your shoulder to climb out, and she didn't care if it pushed you under." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely empty, like a man who had spent his life looking at his reflection in a mirror, only to realize the glass was empty. He didn't have an argument left. The structure of his lies had been so completely dismantled that he was left standing in the bare, cold reality of what he had done. At 8 o'clock that evening, the rain was still falling, a heavy, relentless sheet that turned the dark windows into black mirrors. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, demanding sound that made Warren gasp. He had spent the last 3 hours on the sofa in the den, his knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the dark television screen. He looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide with a sudden, wild panic. "Don't answer it," he whispered, his hand reaching out to grab the hem of my cardigan as I walked past the sofa. "Lorraine, please, don't answer it. It's the police, or the bank. Don't let them in." "The police don't usually ring the bell on a Friday night to discuss a civil default, Warren," I said, gently pulling my cardigan from his fingers. I went to the front door, turned the key in the lock, and pulled it open. Standing on the porch, his golf jacket soaked through, his gray hair plastered wetly to his forehead, was Arthur Vance. He was 58, a man who had spent his entire life in this valley, rising from a teller to the branch manager of the Main Street Bank by being polite, keeping his mouth shut, and never making waves. Tonight, his politeness was gone. His face was lined with a deep gray exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling as he gripped the lapels of his wet jacket. "Lorraine," he gasped, his breath smelling of stale whiskey and mints. I need to come in, please, just for 5 minutes." "It's late, Arthur," I said, standing in the doorway, not moving to let him pass. "And the rain is heavy." "Lorraine, please," he begged, his voice dropping into a frantic, hushed whisper as he looked over his shoulder at the empty street. "Denise Vance, she called my regional supervisor this afternoon. They've suspended me, Lorraine. They've locked me out of the system. They're sending a forensic audit team to my branch on Monday morning." "I know," I said. Denise was very efficient. "You have to help me," he said, his hands reaching out, his fingers touching the wood of the doorframe. "If they audit that September 12th filing, If they see the signature wasn't yours, it's not just a compliance error, it's notary fraud. It's a federal offense, Lorraine. I'll lose my license, I'll lose my pension, my wife, my kids. We'll lose everything. He pulled a folded piece of white paper from the inside pocket of his wet jacket. It was dry, protected by a plastic sleeve. A ratification document, Arthur whispered, his eyes bright with a desperate, frantic hope. I have it right here. If you sign this now, we can backdate it to September 10th. We can say there was an administrative error at the branch, that you signed a temporary power of attorney before you went to Chicago. If you sign this, the audit goes away. The bank won't call the loan. Warren won't go to jail, and I can save my pension. He was offering me the same transaction Warren had offered, my silence, my compliance, my signature to erase his crime. He believed that because I was a woman, because I had always been quiet, I would eventually do what was necessary to keep the peace. No, Arthur, I said. Lorraine, you don't understand, he cried, his voice rising, a sharp, panicked note breaking through his whisper. If they audit my branch on Monday, they aren't just going to look at the second mortgage. They're going to look at all the Main Street accounts. They're going to look at the 3 withdrawals Warren made from your mother's trust account last spring. The hallway felt suddenly, terrifyingly cold. The blue wallpaper seemed to press in on me, the ticking of the clock in the kitchen growing so loud it sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. My mother's trust? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, Arthur said, his eyes locking onto mine with a desperate, ugly satisfaction as he realized he had finally found the leverage he needed. Warren had a signature card, Lorraine. He used a duplicate power of attorney to clear $22,000 from her personal trust account in April to pay for Teresa's boutique lease. If the audit proceeds, the bank's legal team will freeze your mother's trust immediately to protect the assets. Fairview won't get their monthly check on Monday. They'll ling-vict her, Lorraine. They'll put her in the county home by the end of the week. He stood on the wet porch, the rain dripping from the brim of his hood, his face twisted into a desperate, pleading grin. You have to sign it, he whispered, to save your mother. I looked at the plastic sleeve in Arthur's wet hand. The white paper inside looked clean, dry, and entirely harmless. A simple page of text designed to wash away a mountain of fraud with a few drops of black ink. Leave the document, Arthur, I said, my voice as cold and flat as the rain dripping from the porch roof. Arthur hesitated, his fingers tightening on the plastic for a second before he slowly let go. Lorraine, please. Monday morning at 8. The audit team, they don't play. If that paper isn't in the file before they open the vault, we're all going down. I'll call you at 8 tomorrow, Arthur, I said. I closed the door. The brass latch gave its familiar loose clatter, and then the hallway was quiet again. I stood in the dim light of the entry hall, holding the plastic sleeve against my apron. In the den, Warren was sitting on the edge of the sofa, his head in his hands. He had heard every word. The walls of our house were thin, and the silence of the evening had carried Arthur's desperate, whiskey-soaked voice straight to where he was cowering. He didn't look up when I walked into the room. He looked like an old coat thrown over a chair, shrunk, empty, and entirely devoid of the man who had spent 30 years directing my life. You took the money from her trust, I said. It wasn't a question. Warren slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, the skin around his mouth loose and trembling. I was going to put it back, Lorraine. Teresa, she had this payment due on her equipment. If she didn't pay it, they were going to repossess the looms. It was just a bridge loan. I had the paperwork ready to transfer the funds back as soon as she sold her winter line.
A bridge loan, I said, my voice barely a whisper. From a 79-year-old woman who doesn't know what month it is.
Arthur said it was fine,
he cried, his voice rising in a desperate, pleading squeak.
He said he could handle the signatures at the branch. He knew we were good for it. We've been with that bank for 30 years, Lorraine. We're not strangers.
No, I said, you're not strangers. You're just thieves. I turned and walked away from him, ignoring his soft, pathetic cries as he called my name. I went up the stairs to our bedroom, but I didn't go to the bed. I went to the small, walk-in closet under the eaves. In the very back, behind my winter coats and a box of old sewing patterns, was a gray metal lockbox my father had given me when I graduated from high school. It was heavy, made of cold rolled steel, the key hidden inside an old sewing machine oil can on the top shelf. I retrieved the key, unlocked the box, and pulled out the thick, blue-covered folder containing the Gloria Miller Irrevocable Trust, drafted 26 years ago by Raymond. I sat on the floor of the closet under the single, bare light bulb, my fingers running down the yellowed pages of the legal document. I had read it when my father died, but that was 12 years ago, and my mind had been filled with the immediate, heavy fog of grief. I found section 4.2. My father had been a carpenter. He had spent his life measuring twice and cutting once. He knew that the people you love are often the most dangerous when they are desperate. The clause was printed in clear, simple text. Section 4.2. Limitations on disbursements. Any withdrawal exceeding $3,000, $3,000 from the principal or interest of this trust shall require the joint written consent of the trustee, Gloria Miller, and the co-trustee, Lorraine Miller, verified by physical signature at the holding institution. Arthur Vance had that document on file at the Main Street branch. He had known the rules, but he had bypassed them because Warren was his friend, because they played golf on Thursdays, and because he believed that as long as the money was returned, no one would ever look close enough to see the missing signature. This meant the bank, not just Arthur, had committed a massive, indefensible breach of fiduciary duty. They had allowed $22,000 to be withdrawn from an irrevocable trust without the legal co-trustee's consent. If the audit proceeded on Monday, the bank's regional office wouldn't just freeze the trust to protect it. They would realize they were civilly and criminally liable for the loss of the funds. They would have to restore the $22,000 to my mother's account immediately to avoid a devastating lawsuit for negligence. Arthur Vance wasn't trying to save my mother from eviction. He was trying to save the bank and himself from a multi-million-dollar liability and a prison sentence. A woman who has spent 30 years keeping the peace doesn't know how to fight with her fists. She fights with the quiet, heavy truth, waiting for the paper walls of her husband's lies to collapse under their own weight. I folded the trust document and slid it into my handbag, right beside the copy of the forged second mortgage. I walked out of the closet and down the hall to the guest room. The bed was bare, the mattress covered in a blue and white striped ticking that smelled of lavender and cedar. I took a set of clean sheets from the linen closet, spread them over the mattress, and tucked the corners in with the neat, military folds my mother had taught me 40 years ago. Warren was still sitting on the sofa when I went back downstairs. He looked up, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic hope as he saw me carrying my sewing basket. "Lorraine?" he asked, his voice trembling. Are you going to sign it? For your mother?" I didn't look at him. I sat in the armchair by the window, took a white linen tablecloth that had a small tear in the hem, and threaded my needle with fine white cotton. "I'm going to bed, Warren," I said.
my voice perfectly level as I made the first tiny stitch. "And tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, we're going to see your friend Arthur." He let out a long, shuddering sigh, his shoulders slumping as he leaned back against the sofa. He believed he had won. He believed that, like always, I had swallowed my pride and my anger to protect the family from the mess he had made. He didn't see the needle in my hand. He didn't see how steady my fingers were as I pulled the thread through the linen, closing the tear so neatly that when I was finished, the seam would be entirely invisible. Saturday morning arrived with a low, iron-gray fog that hung thick in the branches of the weeping willow. The rain had stopped, but the air was wet and cold, smelling of rotting leaves and the damp concrete of the driveway. Warren was up at 6. I heard him in the bathroom, the splash of water, the scrape of his razor, the heavy, deliberate thud of his boots as he dressed. By the time I came down to the kitchen, he was sitting at the table, a cup of instant coffee in his hand. He looked different. The terror that had shrunk his shoulders the night before had settled into a quiet, eager relief. He believed the crisis was over. He believed that, as always, I had swallowed my anger to protect the family from the mess he had made. "We should get moving," he said, his voice carrying a faint, patronizing warmth that made my skin crawl. Arthur said he'd be waiting at the side door of the branch at 7:45. He wanted to get everything signed before the Saturday staff arrives at 9. "I'm ready," I said. I didn't make breakfast. I put on my wool coat, tucked the leather gloves into my pocket, and took my handbag from the hall table. The drive into town was silent. Warren drove with both hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the foggy road. Every now and then he would reach out and touch the dashboard, a gentle, possessive gesture, as if he were re-establishing his ownership of the truck, the road, and the wife sitting beside him. "You're doing the right thing, Rainey," he said, his tone turning soft, almost parental. "Family has to stick together when things get rough. Teresa, she's always been flighty, but she's still your sister, and we'll get that money back in the savings. I'll work some overtime at the plant. We'll make it work." He was already rewriting the story. In his mind, he wasn't a thief who had forged his wife's signature. He was a good man who had taken a necessary risk for his family, and I was the sensible wife who had helped him clear up a temporary misunderstanding. I didn't answer. I watched the gray trees slide past the window. The Main Street Bank was a heavy brick building with tall, arched windows that were dark on a Saturday morning. Arthur Vance was waiting at the narrow metal door near the drive-through lane. He had changed into a dry wool sweater, but his face still carried the gray, paper-thin look of a man who hadn't slept a single minute. He opened the door the moment we walked up, ushering us into the dark lobby. The smell of floor wax and cold marble was thick in the air. "Thank God, Lorraine," Arthur whispered, his hands trembling as he locked the door behind us. "I've got the papers on my desk. We can have this sorted in 5 minutes." We walked back to his private office, a carpeted corner room with heavy oak furniture and a framed photograph of his wife on the credenza. On his desk, sitting on the green leather blotter, was the plastic sleeve containing the ratification document and a heavy black pen. Arthur sat behind his desk, his fingers tapping frantically against the wood. He slid the document toward me. "Right there, Lorraine," he said, pointing to the yellow highlight line at the bottom of the page. "Just sign and date it September 10th. I'll handle the notary stamp and get it into the regional folder before the compliance team logs in on Monday." I didn't take the pen. I sat in the leather chair, placed my handbag on my lap, and opened the clasp. I pulled out the blue-covered folder containing the Gloria Miller Irrevocable Trust and laid it on the desk, right on top of his ratification document. Arthur blinked, his eyes darting from the blue folder to my face. What's that?" he asked. "This is my father's trust document, Arthur," I said, my voice quiet, carrying the heavy, flat weight of the gray morning. Specifically, Section 4.2, the clause that requires the joint written consent of both trustees for any withdrawal exceeding $3,000. Arthur's hand froze on the desk. The gray color in his face turned a strange, translucent yellow under the fluorescent lights. "Lorraine," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Warren, who was standing in the doorway, his face pale and confused. That's an internal trust matter. We're here to handle the second mortgage. We don't have time to go over the trust files today." "We do have time, Arthur," I said, leaning forward, "because on September 12th, you notarized a forged signature on a $75,000 deed of trust. And last April, you permitted Warren to withdraw $22,000 from an irrevocable trust without my co-signature, in direct violation of the bank's fiduciary duty." "Lorraine, what are you doing?" Warren cried from the doorway, taking a step into the office, his voice rising in a sharp, panicked squeak. "You said we were going to fix this. You said you were going to sign the paper." "I'm going to fix it, Warren," I said, not looking at him. My eyes remained fixed on Arthur's trembling hands. "The bank's regional audit team is arriving on Monday morning. If they find those unauthorized trust withdrawals, they'll realize the bank is civilly liable for the entire $22,000. They'll have to restore those funds immediately to avoid a negligence lawsuit from my lawyer." Arthur let out a soft, dry gasp. He looked at the blue folder, then at the black pen, and finally at me. He was a branch manager. He knew the law. He knew that if the regional office found a fiduciary breach of that scale, they wouldn't just fire him. They would turn the file over to the state bank regulators. What do you want, Lorraine?" Arthur whispered, his voice dropping into a flat, dead register. "I want 3 things, Arthur," I said. I took the black pen from the blotter, but I didn't sign the ratification. I held it between my fingers, letting him see how steady my hands were. "First, you will file a notice of administrative error and cancellation for the $75,000 deed of trust on my primary residence, citing an unauthorized transaction. You will release the lien on my home before the audit team arrives on Monday." Arthur's mouth fell open. I can't just cancel a $75,000 mortgage, Lorraine. The funds have already been dispersed. The bank has to recover that money." "Then the bank can recover it from Warren," I said, "and from Teresa's remaining assets in Ohio. But my home will be clear." Warren let out a sharp, strangled cry from the doorway. "Lorraine, no!" he begged, his hands reaching out toward me, his eyes wide with a horrific, sickening realization. "If they cancel the mortgage for fraud, they'll prosecute me. The bank will file criminal charges to recover the debt. I'll go to jail." I didn't turn to look at him. I kept my eyes on Arthur. "Second," I said, "the bank will restore the $22,000 to my mother's trust account, citing an internal processing error. And third, you will sign an affidavit confirming that Warren acted without my knowledge or consent on both transactions." Arthur stared at me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, frantic breaths. He looked at Warren, who was shaking, tears of pure terror running down his face. "Lorraine, please," Warren sobbed, dropping to his knees beside my chair. He grabbed the hem of my wool coat, his fingers trembling against the fabric. 32 years, Rainey. We have children. We have Mitchell. You'd destroy our family for some money? You'd let them put your husband in a cell?" I slowly reached down and peeled his fingers from my coat, one by one. His hand felt cold, damp, and entirely empty of the power he had used to rule my life for 3 decades. "You destroyed the family last Christmas, Warren," I said, my voice barely louder than a breath. "I'm just clearing the ledger." Arthur Vance sat at his keyboard, his fingers moving over the keys with a frantic, stuttering rhythm. The clatter of the plastic keys was the only sound in the dark, quiet office, punctuated by the soft, wet sniffing of Warren, who remained on his knees by the corner of the desk. Arthur didn't look at Warren. He didn't look at me. His entire universe had shrunk to the glowing blue screen of his monitor and the legal boilerplate he was pulling from the bank's internal database. He was a man who had spent his life navigating the narrow channels of corporate self-preservation. He knew that when a ship is sinking, you don't waste time trying to save the cargo. You just grab the life vest. He clicked a final button, and the printer in the corner of the room groaned into life. The warm, dry smell of heated toner filled the office as 3 pages slid into the tray. Arthur retrieved them, his hand shaking so violently that the paper rustled like dry leaves. He laid them on the green leather blotter, "The administrative release of lien," he whispered, his voice dry and paper-thin. "It cites a system filing error and a failure of signature verification at the branch level. I've entered the override code. The lien on the Cedar Ridge property will show as fully released by Monday noon." He pulled the next page toward him. "And the affidavit of unauthorized transaction," he said, his pen hovering over the signature line. "It confirms that you had no knowledge of and did not authorize the September 12th deed of trust or the April withdrawals from the Gloria Miller Trust. It lays the liability entirely on the branch and the co-signer." He signed both documents. The gold nib of his pen made a sharp, scratching sound against the paper, the sound of 30 years of friendship, golf games, and shared secrets being erased with 3 drops of black ink. He slid the copies across the desk to me. I picked them up, folded them neatly, and slid them into my handbag. I snapped the brass clasp shut. The sharp, metallic click was like the sound of a key turning in a lock. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, rising from the leather chair. "Lorraine," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading whisper as he looked up at me over his glasses. "The audit team. They're still coming on Monday. I've protected the bank's liability, but they're going to find the missing funds. They're going to go after Warren to recover the $75,000. "I know," I said. I looked down at Warren. He was still on the floor, his head resting against the mahogany paneling of the desk. His corduroy shirt was wrinkled, his hair messy, his face bloated and red from crying. He looked like an old, discarded coat that someone had dropped in the hallway and forgotten to pick up. "Stand up, Warren," I said, my voice quiet and perfectly level. "We're leaving." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up from the carpet. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at me. He walked out of the office, his boots dragging on the floorboards. his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to make himself invisible in the long, dark hallway of the bank. We got into the truck. The cab was cold, the windshield covered in a thick layer of gray condensation that Warren didn't bother to wipe away. He started the engine, the heater roaring into life, filling the small space with the smell of damp carpet and hot oil. He didn't shift into gear. He sat with his hands resting on the steering wheel, his forehead touching the cold plastic of the rim, his shoulders shaking with silent, dry sobs. "Mitch," he whispered. "I have to call Mitch. He'll talk to you. He won't let you do this to me, Lorraine." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed with a trembling thumb. He put the phone on speaker, resting it on the dashboard between us. The line rang 3 times before Mitchell's voice came through, loud and cheerful, completely untouched by the gray, suffocating cold of our morning. "Hey, Dad, you guys out early? I'm just getting ready to take the dog to the park." "Mitch," Warren sobbed, his voice breaking, a high-pitched, pathetic sound that made the heater seem to grow quiet. "Mitch, you have to help me. Your mother, she's destroying me, son. She's going to let the bank prosecute me. I'm going to jail, Mitch." There was a long, startled silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the distant sound of Mitchell's dog barking, the clatter of a coffee mug being set on a counter. "Dad?" Mitchell asked, his voice instantly turning sharp, defensive, and deeply confused. "What are you talking about? What did you do?" I reached out, took the phone from the dashboard, and held it to my mouth. "Mitchell," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the gray fog outside the window. "Your father forged my signature to take out a $75,000 second mortgage on our home to pay for Teresa's boutique. And last April, he cleared $22,000 from your grandmother's trust account to pay for her lease. The bank is conducting an audit on Monday." The silence that followed was so thick that I could hear the faint, metallic hum of the phone's battery. "Dad?" Mitchell whispered. His voice had lost its adult confidence. He sounded like an 8-year-old boy who had just watched his father drop the Christmas tree. "Dad, is that true? Did you take Grandma's money?" Warren didn't answer. He couldn't. He pressed his face harder against the steering wheel, his hands gripping the plastic until his knuckles turned yellow. "Mitchell," I said, my voice soft but entirely unbreakable. "I've released the lien on our home, and the bank is restoring your grandmother's trust. But your father will have to answer for the debt. I'm going to hang up now. I'll call you when we get home." "Mom, wait!" I clicked the screen off. The red light on the dashboard died, leaving us in the quiet, humid dark of the cab. A child will forgive a father's weakness, but he will never forgive the realization that the father was willing to make the mother the scapegoat for his own cowardice. Warren had spent Mitchell's entire life presenting himself as the strong, reliable provider, the man who held the family together. In less than 2 minutes, that man had vanished, leaving nothing but a frightened, dishonest boy who had tried to hide behind his wife's skirt. Warren slowly shifted the truck into drive. He didn't look at me as we pulled out of the bank parking lot into the empty, foggy street. Where am I going to go?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the gray asphalt ahead. "The savings are gone, Lorraine. I have nothing. Teresa's in Ohio. I have nowhere to go." I looked out the window at the weeping willow on Elm Street as we turned the corner. The branches were bare, the yellow leaves lying in a thick, wet carpet over the lawn my father had mowed for 30 years. "You have 48 hours to pack your things, Warren," I said, my voice quiet, carrying the heavy, peaceful weight of a woman who had finally stopped carrying everyone else's water. "And then, you're going to have to find your own way." We returned to the house at 9. Warren went straight to the basement, his heavy boots making a slow, hollow sound on the stairs before the cellar door clicked shut behind him. I stayed in the kitchen. The house felt larger now, the rooms empty of the heavy, suffocating tension that had filled them for days. I went up to our bedroom, the room we had shared for 32 years, and pulled 2 large canvas duffel bags from the top shelf of the closet. They were covered in a fine layer of gray dust that smelled of old wool and cedar. I set them on the mattress. Then, methodically, quietly, I began the administrative work of ending our life together. I didn't throw things. I didn't tear his shirts or break his frames. I simply opened his dresser drawers and began to fold. I folded his flannel work shirts, the green wool sweaters I had mended at the elbows, the thick wool socks I had washed 1,000 times. I packed his shaving kit, his spare boots, his winter coat with the hood that smelled of tobacco and pine shavings. I did it with the same quiet efficiency I had used to pack Mitchell's boxes for college or organize my mother's clothes for Fairview. The most devastating part of a long lie isn't the moment it's told. It's the realization of how much of your own history has to be rewritten in the dark. Every memory you carry, every sacrifice you made, every time you said, "We have to be careful with the budget this month," has to be re-examined under the cold, harsh light of the truth. You realize you weren't a partner in a shared life. You were merely the housekeeper of a theater, keeping the seats swept while the main performance was happening somewhere else. At noon, Mitchell called. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, the phone held to my ear, watching the gray fog begin to lift from the lawn outside. "Mom," he said. He sounded tired, his voice carrying the heavy, flat exhaustion of a son who had spent the last 3 hours trying to understand a father he no longer recognized. "I'm driving down. I'll be there by 6. "You don't need to drive down, Mitchell," I said gently. "Your father is packing his things. The bank has released the lien. The house is secure." "I'm coming anyway, Mom," he said, his tone carrying a sudden protective firmness that made him sound older, more like my father than his own. "Chloe's coming with me. We don't want you in that house alone with him, not after what he did to Grandma's trust." "Your father is not dangerous, Mitchell," I said. "He's just small." "I'm still coming," he said. "I'll see you at 6, Mom. I love you." "I love you too, son." I hung up, the silence of the room returning like water closing over a stone. At 3 o'clock, I went down to the basement to get some empty cardboard boxes from the storage room behind Warren's workshop. The cellar was cold, the concrete floor sending a damp chill up through the soles of my shoes. The door to his workshop was slightly ajar. A single yellow light bulb hung from a cord over his workbench, throwing long, distorted shadows against the pegboard wall. Warren wasn't there. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of his saw in the woodpile outside. He was cutting logs for the winter, his movements frantic and loud, as if he were trying to outrun the cold that was coming for him. I walked into his workshop. The room smelled of WD-40, sawdust, and the sweet, dry scent of cedar. On his workbench, his tools hung in their neat, black-outlined slots. The hammers, the screwdrivers, the small brass levels I had bought him for his birthdays. But on the corner of the bench, sitting beside a jar of rusted screws, was a small oak drawer that had always been locked. It was the drawer where he kept his tax records, his spare truck keys, and the deeds to our property. Today, the key was in the lock. In his panic, or perhaps in his complete broken exhaustion, he had left it open. I reached out, my fingers touching the cold brass of the key, and pulled the drawer open. Inside, sitting on top of a stack of old utility bills, was a thick brown accordion folder. It was labeled in Warren's neat block handwriting, T.M. Teresa Miller, her maiden name. I pulled the folder out, set it on the dusty surface of the workbench, and opened the clasp. Inside were hundreds of small paper slips, canceled checks, wire transfers, paid invoices, and handwritten letters going back 5 years. I picked up the first slip. It was a bank transfer from our joint savings account, dated June 14, 2020. The amount was $3,400. The recipient was Teresa Miller. Below it was a carbon copy of a paid invoice for a security deposit on an apartment in Greenfield. I picked up the next one. October 2021, $2,800, paid directly to Greenfield Dental Associates for Teresa's root canal. July 2022, $4,000, a wire transfer to a travel agency for a summer wellness retreat in Savannah. Every single transaction was documented in his neat, precise hand. Every time Teresa had lost a job, or dented her car, or wanted to buy a new silk blouse, Warren had reached into our joint savings, pulled out the cash, and handed it to her. And all the while, I had spent those 5 years turning down the thermostat to save $40 a month on the heating bill. I had mended my own coats until the cuffs were frayed. I had skipped our anniversary dinners because Warren said, "We have to be careful this year, Rainey. The water plant is talking about layoffs." It hadn't been a one-year mistake. It hadn't been a sudden, frantic rescue of a sister who was drowning. It had been a systematic, 5-year embezzlement of our marriage. He had been building a life with her in the margins of our household, funded by the very savings I had carefully gathered from my sewing work and the sale of my garden vegetables. I stood in the yellow light of the basement, holding the stack of canceled checks in my hand, the dry paper rustling in the cold air. Outside, the loud, rhythmic shriek of Warren's saw suddenly stopped. I heard the heavy thud of his boots on the gravel outside the cellar door. The brass handle jiggled, the door swinging open with a slow, scraping sound that made the yellow light bulb above my head swing gently on its cord. The cellar door creaked open, the wet draft from the yard rushing down the concrete steps and causing the single, bare light bulb above my head to swing gently on its cord. Warren stood in the doorway, his silhouette wide and dark against the gray afternoon light. He was holding his handsaw, the blade wet with green birch sap, his face flushed and glistening with cold sweat. He stopped. His eyes went from my face to the brown accordion folder resting open on the dusty workbench, and then to the stack of canceled checks I held in my gloved hands. The silence that fell between us was different from any silence we had shared before. It wasn't the tense, quiet preparation for a domestic argument, nor was it the heavy, defensive quiet of the last 48 hours. It was the absolute, lifeless silence of an empty room after the plaster has fallen from the ceiling. He didn't try to explain. He didn't yell. The 5-year history of his betrayal was lying open under the yellow light bulb, documented in his own neat block handwriting. "Lorraine," he said, his voice barely a rattle in his throat. I didn't look at him with anger. I didn't feel the hot, tearing urge to scream or throw the papers at his feet. I felt only a profound, peaceful exhaustion, the quiet relief of a traveler who has finally reached the end of a long, heavy road and laid her pack in the dust. I neatly stacked the canceled checks, slid them back into the brown folder, and closed the brass clasp. I placed the folder back into the oak drawer, turned the key in the lock, and slid the key into my apron pocket. "Mitchell will be here at 6, Warren," I said, my voice quiet and perfectly steady as I walked past him toward the stairs. "He'll help you load your bags into the truck." By 5 o'clock, the fog had completely cleared, leaving the valley sharp, cold, and dark under a canopy of early winter stars. At precisely 6, the headlights of Mitchell's car swept across the living room windows. I watched from the front porch as he parked near the garage, his wife Chloe sitting quietly in the passenger seat. He got out, his coat collar turned up against the wind, and walked up the gravel path. He didn't look at his father's truck. He walked straight to me, his arms wrapping around my shoulders in a tight, silent embrace that smelled of cold wool and the long highway from Chicago. Warren came out of the front door 10 minutes later, carrying the 2 canvas duffel bags I had packed for him. He looked small under the yellow porch light, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. He stopped at the top of the steps, looking at Mitchell with a desperate, pleading eagerness. A father waiting for his son to offer a hand, a word, or even a glance of recognition. Mitchell didn't look at him. He stood beside me, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder, his eyes fixed on the empty gravel of the driveway. Warren slowly walked down the steps. The wooden boards didn't creak. The new pine piece he had nailed over the rot was perfectly silent under his weight. He threw his bags into the back of his truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The headlights flared, cutting through the dark yard, and then the truck rolled down the hill, the red taillights disappearing into the shadows of the valley. He was gone. 3 weeks later, the Elm Street cottage was empty. The bank's regional office, terrified of the legal implications of the unauthorized trust withdrawals and the forged second mortgage, had moved with frantic, silent efficiency. The $75,000 lien on my primary residence was officially released. The $22,000 was restored to my mother's trust account, ensuring her room at Fairview was secure for as long as she needed it. I didn't stay in the Cedar Ridge house. I sold my share of the primary property to Mitchell and Chloe for $1, giving them the home where they could build their own life, clean of the quiet rot Warren and I had left behind. I moved into the cottage my father had built. It was a cold, bright Tuesday afternoon when I finally finished unpacking the last of my sewing boxes. The small house smelled of fresh cedar, lavender, and the hot tea I had brewed in my mother's blue cornflower pot. The new brass deadbolt Warren had installed on the front door was solid and secure. I locked it from the inside, the mechanism sliding into the frame with a deep, satisfying click. I sat in the armchair by the window, my father's old pine table resting near my elbow, the sunlight coming through the clean glass and warming the floorboards beneath my feet. Underneath me, the 3-inch joists held the house perfectly steady against the cold north wind. For 32 years, I had believed that love was a matter of constant, silent sacrifice. That if I scrubbed the floors clean enough, kept the drafts out, and absorbed the quiet damage of the people I loved, the structure would eventually hold. But as I sat there in the quiet of my father's house, watching the dry willow leaves drift across the lawn in the autumn light, I finally understood the truth. A woman can spend her entire life keeping the peace inside a home, only to realize the only peace she ever truly needed was the one she had to leave the house to find.